Hey folks, this is Paul talking about A Course in Miracles. Now, in the Course there's a theme to do with the contrast between freedom and imprisonment. But I don't hear this being talked about hardly ever. I don't even know if I can even remember anybody talking about it. But, we often think in terms of separation and joining, or judgment and forgiveness, light and darkness, and all, true perception, false perception, all this kind of stuff. But in the Course there's also a theme of imprisonment and freedom. And it's to do with you imprisoning yourself, and you trying to imprison your brother, and your brother imprisoning himself, and your ability to set yourself free, and your ability to set your brother free from his imprisonment and from the imprisonment that you put on your brother. This is a pretty big theme, so it's interesting to think about how the dynamics of relationships and ego and stuff in terms of freedom, in terms of, is this in some way attempting to limit somebody and confine them and imprison them? Or is it in some way trying to set someone free? And of course this is very much related to free will. Now, in the Course there's a part talking about how the soul never leaves the sight of God. The soul has already been perfectly, fully created, and it's changeless, and it never leaves God's sight. But the mind, which is different from the soul, is the place of decision and free will, and the mind is a medium that the soul uses for thinking and expression and creating. The soul uses the power of the mind as a kind of tool or device through which it extends and creates, and can use it to create other beings and so on. But when the mind is being misused, or the mind is resisting the authority of the soul, the mind goes into a state of tyrannical rulership in which it imprisons. So now we're talking about how the entire separation from God is a state of trying to go into an imprisoned state. And all of the ego thought system is all about being tyrannical and imprisoning, and all the limitations that brings, all of the condemnation, the accusation, the judgment, the finding guilty, the accusing of sin, passing judgment on something and finding it to be deserving of punishment, deserving of being locked up and isolated and stuck in a prison, to rot in the dungeons of hell. Now, so it says, the mind, if it votes to do so, becomes a medium by which the soul can create along the lines of its own creation. And an interesting thing there is it suggests that the mind is what is voting whether or not to be used by the soul for creation, as if the mind itself is somehow the thing that is choosing the separation and not the soul. It's just an interesting wording. If the mind, if it votes to do so, becomes a medium by which the soul can create along the lines of its own creation. If it, the mind, does not freely elect to do so, it retains this creative ability but places itself under tyrannous rather than authoritative control. As a result, what it creates is imprisonment, because such are the dictates of tyrants. So as soon as the mind entertains the tiny mad idea and chooses to believe it, to believe in sin, the mind is rejecting the authority of the soul and the authority of God as the Father, and now the mind is putting itself into a state of rebellion and is kind of become rogue and becomes a tyrant. So I had to look up this morning the definition of a tyrannical ruler. So like someone who hasn't really been appointed by anybody through any kind of democratic process, somebody who just sort of takes over and is very selfish and oppressive and controlling and just does whatever the hell they want, breaking every possible law, having no kind of moral values or whatever. An example would be someone like Hitler or Stalin, someone who just believes in their own thing. They just want to do their own thing, and they use their freedom to try to oppress and take away and ignore the freedoms of others, where the will is being used against the will. So like as you reject reality and you go into a sort of a state of unwillingness to will with God, it's an attempt to use the will against itself, to say, I will not to will with God, I will not to be willing, and it's an unwillingness. It's like, I don't want to will with God. I'm resistant and reluctant to accept God. I want to resist it. And this puts it into this sort of state where the mind is against being willful, and so the mind is now investing in doing things against will, and so now it becomes tyrannical, and it tries to have power over other minds or other wills and over itself. And so now it imposes a state of dominance over itself and others. There's another good statement here, if I can find it. Tyrannical rulership. If you place your mind under tyranny rather than authority, you introduce the submission dominance onto free will itself. This produces the obvious contradiction inherent in any formulation that associates free will with imprisonment. So in that unwillingness, you actually introduce an idea of submission and dominance, sort of an imbalance and inequality into the mind. And the mind now believes in inequality and differences. It's the whole ego thought system. So now it's having this, some parts are more dominant than others, some parts are more submissive than others. And now you have the mind trying to dominate and forcibly control and violate the laws of God and violate free will, and you've got other parts that are submissive and take on victim roles and are dominated and imprisoned and forced against their will. And you have this leads to the whole world and all of the shit that happens. So the whole ego thought system is a system of the repression of freedom and the imposing of will upon will, producing states of imprisonment. So when you're going into this egotism, this selfishness, this tyranny, and you become a tyrannical person, it imprisons you, and it attempts to imprison others. So now you get into accusation of sin. If you have accused yourself of this sin, this being a tyrant is sinful, you're putting yourself into an imprisoned state. It's a state of lack, a state of limitation, a state of isolation, a state of exclusion, a state of possession and ownership, and this basically anchors you into body identification, and the body now is a prison that locks you up, and you're now trapped in a body as a prison cell that has its barrier is the prison walls, and you're separated off and kept away from everybody else. And now the ego is now using the body as a separation device to keep you separated off and imprisoned and confined, so that through this belief in tyrannical rulership. So you kind of become the victim of your own tyranny. Secret of Salvation, where your entry into the tyrannical attitude and being dominant and trying to force will against will and violating free will imprisons you. Now, it's interesting that you'll find it's not possible to go against the will of God. When you try to will against God's will, you're basically saying, I will not to will, because all will is free will. It's willingness. So if you're saying, I'm not going to will, or I'm going to will against will itself, then you become, you have to reject willingness. And so now you go into unwillingness, and you go into not willing. So what that means is you cannot will against God. When you try to will against God, you become, your will is basically shut down, and it's kind of cancelled, and it loses its willingness, and so it becomes no will at all and can't will anything. So it's an automatic dynamic where you cannot will against God's will. If you try to will against God's will, you lose your freedom of will, and this places you in an imprisoned state, self-inflicted, in which you don't have any will. So that's what leads to you being in a body, a self-inflicted imprisonment, and you go from there. So let's see. Special relationships. Where is that one? The closer that you look at the special relationship, which is typically a body emphasized, a body-based relationship, the more apparent it becomes that it must foster guilt. Therefore, it must imprison. The special relationship is totally without meaning without a body. If you value it, you must value the body, and what you value, you will keep. The special relationship is a device for limiting yourself to a body, and for limiting your perception of others to theirs. So now, having imprisoned yourself through unwillingness, by the way, the whole idea of the ego having this free will, this kind of free roaming, lawless, rule-breaking, doesn't want to abide by God's will, doesn't want to do anything that is suggested that it do, wants to be free from God, passes for free will in this world. And the ego, this ego version of free will that looks as though someone is choosing and someone is defying God and someone is not wanting to do stuff, and this sort of rebellious will is really a state of not freedom. It is the opposite of having freedom. And so what appears to be free will in this world is really imprisoned will, but it's an illusion of imprisonment that looks like freedom. Somebody being very, very self-independent and not relying on God whatsoever Somebody who doesn't depend on spirit, someone who's very body identified, may look as though they have a lot of free will, but they're not being free because of their rejection of freedom. So there's an illusion of freedom, and this illusion of freedom makes it seem as though the person's will is having free will, and it's freely going about its business and ignoring reality and ignoring God, when in fact it's very, very much not free. It just is it's deception, an illusion of freedom. So what we call in this world often free will, this sort of notion that you can just rebel against God and you can go against his will and you can reject the truth and all this stuff, it's really a rejection of freedom, and it's really an imprisoned state that seems like freedom. It's similar to how the ego is not a self. You have a real self, and in the rejection of your real self, you attempt to become something you're not, which produces this ego, or the false self, that isn't a self. It's actually the rejection of having a self. So the ego is actually self-destruction and leads to death as a result, because it's the attempt to get rid of the Son of God and not have a self at all. So again, this ego that we think is a thing, and it's a real self, and we have to get rid of this self. It's an illusion of having a self. It's actually backwards, and it's actually an implosion of self. It's a lack of self. Ego is a lack of identity. So it's interesting how it always seems to be something it's not. I don't know where I was going with that. Okay, bodies, special relationships. So by rejecting freedom, rejecting free will, rejecting will, becoming unwilling imprisons you and isolates you and confines you, and this shows up symbolically as a body. The physical body is a separation device. You now have a special relationship with it. The body now seems to be the prison, or the tiny fence that the Son of God draws around a piece of the mind. This fence, this wall keeping you in, seeming to split you off from the rest, acts like a prison cell. And you now hate it. Let's see if that's... Here we go. You see yourself as locked in a separate prison, remote and unreachable, incapable of reaching out as of being reached. You hate the prison that you made, and you would destroy it. Yet you would not escape from it, leaving it unharmed, without your guilt upon it. But only thus can you escape. This is an important thing. You see yourself as locked in a separate prison, remote and unreachable, incapable of reaching out as of being reached. You hate the prison that you made, the body, and you would destroy it, because this body, even if you're using it sort of deliberately and saying, I want to be imprisoned, at the same time, there's hatred in that, there's special relationship in that, and you hate the thing that you've made. Even if part of you saying, I want to be imprisoned and I don't want to be with God, I don't want freedom, simultaneously you're saying, I want to be imprisoned, I want to be under tyrannical rulership, I want to be submissive, I want to be overthrown, I want to usurp God's will, I want to be dominated. And that is going to produce resentment from the other side of it. So now you hate the body because it seems to be a prison to you. And he's saying that because you make the body guilty, you attack it and make it sick, this causes you to stay in the body and to stay in the prison, because you're making the prison real, you're making the unwillingness real, you're seeing yourself as victimized by it, you're confined, you believe in limitation, you believe in space-time, and this anchors you into the prison cell of the body. And so long as you stay in that kind of perception, you are stuck in the body. And you don't think that it's possible for you to escape the body without having to attack the body. So then you try to kill the body in order to try and escape through death. Through death, you seek about self-destruction or body destruction in an attempt to get rid of the body so that you can be free from the prison, which doesn't work because you still believe in imprisonment. So you come back again, have another body. But he's saying that only thus can you escape without your guilt upon it. So somehow you got to find a way to not make the body imprison you, to not think of it as having rulership over you, or the cause of you, or confining you or limiting you in any way. And you have to move past the body and rejoin with mind and so on, so that you don't see the body as your victim and or having rulership over you, and you melt the walls of perception and you transcend the prison so that there's no guilt involved, and then the body does not have the power to seemingly keep you in hell, and you can be set free. But you can only get there by getting free of the guilt and the sin and the making illusions real that causes you to be anchored in a prison state in the first place. You can enslave a body, but an idea is free, incapable of being kept in prison or limited in any way except by the mind that thought it. Okay, so now here's the second piece of this. The illusion of attack. Condemnation, accusation of sin, what you seem to do to your brother, what he seems to do to you. When your mind is holy and free and loving, you know who you are. You're in touch with the truth about you. It's clear. It's recognized. You're not deceived, and you're not in ego. In that condition, you know that you're not sinful and you're not guilty, and there's nothing wrong with you, and you're not unworthy, and you're not have no reason to be afraid, and so on. If your mind goes into this tyrannical rulership state in which you become a tyrant and a dictator and a sufferer and a victim, you go into the ego, you lose sight of that freedom. I'm forgetting what I was talking about. The illusion of attack. So you condemn yourself. You accuse yourself of sin. You say, I've done this thing and it's got real consequences and I'm a sinner and I should be guilty. Your mind becomes split and you disassociate part of yourself and split it off and see it as an enemy or as a sinner. And this other part of you attacks it and accuses it of sin in order to keep the sin locked up and imprisoned in this part of mind, to keep it away from or outside of awareness of the other part. And now there's denial and there's projection and disownership and this attempt to get rid of the sin in the mind by sectioning it off in the mind and pretending that it's not part of you. When you do that, you're likely to be in a dissociated state of mind in which you think you have two selves, and this other self that is the sinful, guilty one seems to be outside of or not myself from the other part, and you will see it as an attacker and you will attack it and try to get away from it and put distance between you through accusation. And this ego uses this projection or this reinforcing of the separation between the pieces of the mind to try to exonerate you from sin, so that the sin is somewhere else and it's in someone, not myself. And this is all taking place within your mind, and you literally will now attack this other part of the mind, believing that it's not yourself. And it's very easy to confuse that with another person and believe that you associate the part of your mind that you disassociated, you associate it with other people, and you think that they are joined with this sin and the guilt, and the sin and the guilt is now in them because it's not in you, and you now accuse your brother of sin, but accuse your brother of your own sins. But the fact is that this is happening in you, and it has nothing to do with your brother. It's another piece of your own self, your own mind that you've cut off, and now you're attacking, believing that it's not yourself, as a way to try to deal with and manage this guilt in the mind. Now, if somebody else is doing this and they're not in a right-minded state, and they come along and they start to attack themselves, and they're going into guilt, and their mind is splitting, and they're dissociating from themselves, and they've split off a part of their identity, and their mind is now at war with itself, and it's attacking itself, and who they've associated as themselves is now in conflict with and opposite to the part of them that they've disowned that's still in their mind. They will think that their sin and guilt is outside of them, even though it's inside their mind, and they will attack it. And now they're having kind of a relationship with it as if it's another person. I don't know if you've heard of the idea that once you start talking to yourself, it's a sign of insanity. So as the person is having a split mind, they start to talk to themselves as if there are two people, as if there is a separate person who is guilty and they are not the guilty one. And in that state, they are attacking towards this other person in their mind, and they try to destroy it. They want to murder it and get rid of it and remove it from the mind by destroying it in the mind. And this tends to, from the outside, from your perspective, it tends to look like they are attacking. And if you're not careful, and if you're not centered in your truth and knowing who you are, being innocent, when they try to attack themselves in a split-minded, dissociated state, it will look as though they are attacking other people other than themselves. They're projecting and they're blaming and they're hurling abuse and accusations as if outside of themselves. They're trying to put the guilt outside themselves, and so they look like they're pointing fingers and blaming things out there outside themselves, but they're really doing it to themselves within their mind still, and they're kind of having almost a hallucination in which they are at war with another piece of their own mind. But from the outside, it can look as though, because of the way that they express that and the words they use and names that they attach to it and fingers that they point and stuff, it can seem like they literally are talking about someone other than themselves, someone that is not them, because they've disowned this whole big chunk of themselves that they hate. That can be very tempting to fall into as a trap and to be deceived by. If you're not in your right mind and you yourself have lost sight of your truth and you've attacked yourself with sin, you've developed the same problem, and you've now got a dissociation in your mind. You've now got a block to awareness. You've got kind of a blind spot. And you also now believe and perceive that there's a you in here, and there's a separation, and then there's this not myself outside the separation, and therefore that this not myself is outside of yourself, and you place this as if it's outside your mind, outside your identity. And now you will think that the person who is attacking you isn't you, and this other person's over here acting as though they're attacking someone other than themselves, and it looks as though it's towards someone not themselves, because you're both having freaking split minds. So now the minds that think that that's who they are separating from the pieces of the mind that they think they're not. And now you've got these two disassociated things that get confused and tangled up, that both parties now seem to engage as if the disassociated part of one mind and the disassociated part of the other mind are actually the same thing, or are talking to each other. And so now in that state, you will think that somebody else's self-attack that looks like an attack on others is about you, and it's when they point a finger at you, that they're somehow talking about you and not about this other part of themselves. And you can get lost in this. You can really be confused by confusing these dissociated parts of mind and thinking that somebody else is actually targeting yourself and is attacking it, hurting it, blaming it, accusing it of sin. And you will have reactions to that because you've lost sight of the truth about yourself. And so now you're confused and you think that your brother is the cause of your upset, or that you are doing something to hurt someone else. And it's not true, because as the Course says, I can be attacked by nothing but my thoughts. Nothing in the world can bring oppression. It can be but myself that I crucify. In many ways it says that the secret of salvation, that you cannot be hurt unless you hurt yourself. Nobody dies without their own consent. All this idea that there is only the possibility that I can attack myself, nobody else can attack me. So if I start having a dissociated mental state where I'm starting to believe that there is another person in my own mind that is not myself, that I'm projecting onto this other person and thinking that they are this other piece of my mind that's attacking me, and I confuse it with this other person, and they're doing this attack stuff, I'm going to start experiencing it as though there literally is two entities that are attacking each other. And now you get lost in conflict and war and fighting and accusation and finger pointing and blame, the scapegoating, which is unforgiveness. And now you're in an unforgiving state where there's an illusion of attack happening and both parties are confused about who they are and they think that the other person is the cause of them. But other people are never the cause of you. God is the only cause of both of you. You're both equal siblings. You're both being caused by God. You do not cause each other. You're not each other's creator. You do not define what you are to each other. You don't make your brother change. You don't have any power over him. With your free will and his free will, it is not possible to will against anyone else. It's not possible for anyone else to will against you, because your will is free. But when you go into the unwillingness and the split mind, and you're going into tyranny and dictatorship and forceful control and all these other ego things, you lose sight of that freedom and you start believing that other people can affect you. It's their fault. They're the ones doing it to you. You're not the one doing it to yourself. You lose sight of your freedom. You lose track of the fact that nothing can happen against your will. You don't realize the power of your thoughts, and you don't realize you're attacking yourself, and you think that you are under tyrannical rulership by someone, not yourself, who's causing you against your will to suffer. And this is where all the ego bullshit comes in. This is what we have to forgive and undo, the belief in, the belief that we now are a victim. Now there's a part here that talks about cursing your brother, whereby these accusations, these projections, this blame and finger pointing is an attempt to imprison someone else. Because if your brother is free, and he has free will, and nothing can happen against that will, but you're in some way in your mind saying, I'm defining what you are limited, you are confined, I'm going to accuse you of sin, I'm going to lock you up in a prison, I'm going to attack you, I'm going to label you as this, particularly in body identification, by saying, hey brother, you're not a spirit being, you are a physical body. That's like saying you are in prison. You are isolated in a location in space and time where you're kept separate from all the rest of existence, and you cannot leave this body. That's what happens when you believe and you get confused that someone is a body. You believe that this brother, this spirit being that God created equal to you, is somehow a physical form, is an object, and is confined and limited by that object, by the body. If you see people as bodies, therefore, if you confuse them for bodies, and you don't realize that bodies are not people, they're not spirits and they're not alive, that is a way of trying to imprison yourself and others by confining them to the prison bodies. This happens through any kind of accusation, any judgment, any condemnation, any projection, any scapegoating, any finger pointing, any blaming, any making people guilty, being angry at people and trying to make them guilty, any physical attack, any attempts to murder and kill, is all forms of the same attempt to limit, to isolate, to imprison, to take away freedoms. If you don't respect the freedom of others, if you don't let them have their freedom, if you don't allow them to choose for themselves, if you are controlling them, if you're manipulating them, if you're trying to coerce them, even God does not coerce, you're trying to force someone into something, you need to get your hands off, because you're violating free will. your own free will is going to be imprisoned because you're having an imprisoning attitude towards others, and that's going to confine you to the body. What applies to you applies to your brother, the golden rule. So if you're having, in any way, encroaching upon the freedom of others, their free will, their freedom to choose, their freedom to be whatever they choose to be, to take their time, their freedom to suffer, their freedom to die if they so choose to do so. And this is difficult stuff to accept and allow. If you try manipulating people, getting them to go in line with your will and what you want and what you think is right for them and what you think is best, blah, 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 that is tyrannical, and it comes across as domineering, controlling, smothering, taking away freedom. And it's an attack, and it's experienced as an offense. It's as someone trying to violate and take something from you. And so if we're doing that, we are trying to imprison our brother. We're trying to say, I want you to do this, and you need to be doing this, and you shouldn't be doing that, and these people need to get together and fucking stop doing this thing, and this group of people over here are all sinners, and all this sort of attempts to not allow. The lack of allowing makes you imprisoned. And I've felt in myself in past years, particularly, this constant sense of not being allowed. And it was me not allowing myself because I was being tyrannical, and I was imprisoning, and I was having control issues and trying to manipulate or force or not approve of things, or wanting things to be different, or wanting people to make different choices that they weren't making, or whatever, was causing me to feel disapproved of, not allowed, limited, confined, and imprisoned. So through that tyrannical action, trying to impose your will upon another will strips you of your freedom, takes away your free will, because you cannot use will against will. It causes it to become the absence of willingness. You're sort of against people having freedom to will what they want. Makes you be against your own freedom to will what you want. So then you lose your freedom by trying to take other people's freedom away. So in the Course, Jesus keeps talking about how we keep trying to imprison our brother, and how we keep trying to limit him and confine him, and how there's a dynamic of mind where the two minds have to agree to suffering, and there's false empathy, there's entering into your brother's illusions and agreeing with them and not setting him free, there's joining in specialness and exclusion and various ways of limiting your brother to a body and limiting him to an imprisoned state, and not seeing his freedom and not recognizing his willingness and his freedom to choose, not recognizing that everything that he's experiencing he has chosen and he wants, and that's his free will, even if it's something you don't like, and even if it's suffering, and even if it's sickness. That's his freedom. So Jesus talks a little bit about cursing. Casting spells merely means affirming error, and error is a lack of love. So trying to reinforce someone's sinfulness. When you project this onto others, you do imprison them, but only to the extent that you reinforce errors they have already made. This distortion makes them vulnerable to the curse of others, since they have already cursed themselves. The miracle worker can only bless, and this undoes the curse and frees the soul from prison. This is quite an important paragraph. It's got some good pieces to it. So if you try to affirm, emphasize, magnify, amplify, focus on, increase the errors or the sin that other people are making, their mistakenness, if you focus on how wrong they are, or you hold against them what they've chosen by mistake, as if that's the whole truth about them, that's a way of you cursing them, and your mind is being used in kind of an attacking way, and it's almost like you're trying to condemn and shut down and force and oppress and diminish and darken and destroy, and it's kind of murderous, this effort to have your brother not be free, and you kind of hold him in the prison with your mind by seeing him as in this way. If thinking you are a body, you really are sick, you really are damaged and broken, you're guilty for the choices you made, you're some drug abuser or whatever, alcoholic or something, and you holding it against them, you are holding them in prison in your mind, and you're sort of picturing them as this imprisoned, limited, confined, corrupted, criminal thing, which is actually taking place in your mind between you and the part of you that you don't want to forgive. So now you've imprisoned yourself and condemned yourself with the things you're condemning your brother for, but condemn your brother of your own sins. And so now this is a way of you imprisoning someone. Your mind is now trying to suggest to your brother that he is not innocent and he's not free, and he doesn't have power, and he cannot choose, and he doesn't have any rights. But as it says here, the affirming of error is just an affirming of the lack of love and your unwillingness to love your brother correctly. When you project this onto others, it does imprison them, but only to the extent that you're reinforcing errors that they have already made. Makes you vulnerable to the curses of others because they've already cursed themselves, which tells you that if someone does not attack themselves, you cannot reinforce their own attack. If they believe in being defective and limited and guilty and sinful, and you do also believe and agree with that they are guilty and sinful, you are reinforcing their self-curse and holding them accountable for being sinful, and you're kind of locking it in and sort of saying, I agree with you, you are sinful and guilty. And so you are imprisoning them along with them imprisoning themselves, and the two of you are agreeing to maintain the prison. And because when someone curses themselves, accuses themselves of sin, it's like believing in being weak and vulnerable and a victim and submissive and dominated and victimized and having no power. And this sort of disowning of power and this positioning of yourself as victimizable or attackable, someone else's cursing of you in that state, a weakened sort of state of mind, where you're saying, I agree with weakness, I'm allowing myself to be weak. Their cursing can actually affect, you're sort of saying, I want to be affected by other people's accusations. I want to take it upon myself. I want to hurt myself with. I want to take personally what they are trying to do and make it hurt me by my own will. And so when someone has cursed themselves and is attacking themselves, is in a state of weakness and vulnerability, belief in vulnerability, that it's kind of like giving permission to another person to attack them and to cause them and to have effects on them. And you set up this sort of mechanism where when someone does further attack you on top of your self-attack, it seems to compound it and make, by your own agreement, your consent, it pushes you further down into the depths of hell. So someone else agreeing with your self-cursing can cause you to go further down to ego and destruction, that you can be kind of oppressed by other people's curses of mind, that someone's view of you in a derogatory way can suppress you and dominate you and have power over you, and other people can keep you imprisoned. But this is only possible because of your consent and your willingness to be imprisoned. So if you make that error and you believe in the sinfulness of yourself, you're sort of saying, here I am, please attack me. I believe I'm attacked and I should be attacked and I should be punished. You invite attack, and if someone over here is coming over and trying to project their self-attack onto you, which normally would have no effect on you, by virtue of the fact that you have hurt yourself and you've sort of created a bruise or a weak spot, they can get in there and make it worse. And so Jesus is basically saying here that you can, when you project this onto others, you do imprison them. That you can increase your brother's suffering. You can make the situation worse. Your mind's power can negatively influence other people's minds, provided that they themselves are in agreement with that happening through their own choice. And it slightly taps into the Christianity view of sin and the devil being able to manipulate sinners. I think it's sort of along the lines of that if you're in sin, or you're believing that you're a sinner and you've condemned yourself and you're having this sinful attitude, sinful behaviors, this somehow gives permission to the devil to, per your agreement, to be able to have the right to attack you and to curse you and to make your life hell and to manipulate you and possess you and so on. This is sort of the same kind of thing, and there's some truth to that. Even though it's not really a devil, it's the ego, or it's the ego in someone else. But basically Jesus is saying, if you have cursed yourself, you've attacked yourself and robbed yourself of your own freedom, you're trying to make it look as if someone else could be the cause of your going into more attack. But even in this scenario, other people are not able to violate your free will. So just as sickness and medicine and so on are just props that the mind is using to make it seem as though, like placebos, trying to make it seem as though these things cause you to be healed, it's really your mind that decides to be healed, and it just uses these things as ministers to pretend that they cause the healing, but it's really a mental decision that you give yourself all sickness and you take all sickness away. it's sort of the same thing, that if you give yourself sinfulness, you can only have that sinfulness increase by your setting your mind up to be sort of saying, I'm going to increase my own sinfulness when I see the opportunity of someone else trying to attack me. I'm going to use their scapegoating as a justification and a reason why I'm going to personally amplify my own suffering. This becomes kind of complicated. But it's always you doing it to yourself, even when it seems like they're the cause. Even when it seems like they are cursing you or imprisoning you, it's only because you yourself are also imprisoning yourself, and you're the one that's saying, I'm going to become more imprisoned when this person tries to imprison me. And you still do it to yourself. There's no exceptions to the secret of salvation. So what that means is, as it says toward the end, a miracle worker can only bless. And this undoes the curse and frees the soul from prison. So if you've set up this thing in your own mind where you believe that under certain circumstances there's justification for you to stay in a cursed state, an imprisoned state, if the other person does not agree with that, and they do not provide support for your self-condemnation, and they show you an example of your innocence by seeing you as it being not true of you, what you believe about yourself, they do not support, trigger, or amplify the mechanisms that you've put in place to make your suffering worse, and they weaken the belief that you have in your own mind that it's true of you. And through that same sort of mechanism, you kind of reverse the cursing of yourself. And so someone else's miracle working blessing of love undoes their attempt to imprison you, and now they're attempting to set you free, and they're recognizing your freedom. They're not believing that you are imprisoned. They don't support your own belief in your own imprisonment. It's much harder for you to be convinced of it and to believe it when other people are not supporting it. And that makes ideal conditions for you to choose not to curse yourself. And that's minds that are joining, minds that are in agreement about their mutual innocence. It's a way that you can actually help your brother to heal. And so you can set your brother free by emphasizing his freedom and not his imprisonment. You can set him free by giving him freedom. You can remind him of his freedom. So psychologically, Jesus is saying that if I attack myself, I make it seem possible for the illusion that someone else can curse me and keep me locked up in my own prison. But simultaneously, it's possible also for someone else to set me free. Set me free, why don't you, babe? By not supporting the imprisonment, not being tyrannical, not emphasizing my sinfulness. Seeing the innocence in me frees me from hell. I found personally on several occasions, if I'm in a pretty centered truthful state of mind, and I sort of had this sort of feeling of knowing what is true about me, that I'm not this and that and this and that. And if someone outside me is trying to accuse me of stuff that I truly, genuinely know isn't true, it causes me to hold a position and to stay unmoved by their accusations. So I'm not going into ego reactions, I'm not going into feeling hurt by it, I'm not going into ego, I'm not going into buying into the illusion, I'm not secretly agreeing with it, I don't have beliefs that haven't been healed that support it, I don't have a weakness in this area. If I'm staying strong in my truth, and someone is attempting to accuse me of sin, which really is them accusing themselves of sin, but in such a way, a dissociated, split-minded way that on the surface looks like trying to point fingers outside of themselves toward the part of them that they are not associating as being, and that makes it look like they're targeting me. If I stay in my center, so to speak, it's almost like broadcasting a fact, broadcasting a truth that doesn't buy into or compound their mistakenness, doesn't believe that it's true what they believe is true and what they're expressing about me, but it's really not about me, it's about them. And if I can stay clear and strong in that truth while they're doing this, and I'm not supporting in any way their cursing, I'm not giving it reality, I'm not buying into it, I'm not reacting to it, I'm just sort of being strong, I suppose, and I'm looking at them usually kind of directly and intently. I've noticed how this shines a light for them, and there's something happening in the joining of minds, and it's as though in their own mind they become aware of the falseness of what they're doing. They become aware that their accusation is unfounded. Because it doesn't have any support, any external support, that two minds have to agree. If I genuinely don't agree, and that doesn't mean accusation, it doesn't mean being right, it doesn't mean disagreement, it just means you are in the truth. You are in that state of mind where you're not getting lost in other people's self-attack. You be a beacon of truth and light for them. Their mind has a lot of trouble trying to get away with that. I've noticed that their mind will suddenly sort of become self-conscious or more aware of the bullshit that's in their accusation. They'll suddenly sort of step back, and it's as though you communicate with them on a psychological level, and you're sort of saying, no, that isn't true, and they're picking up on it somehow mentally, and it does have an influence on their mind, on their perspective, on their thinking, that seems to cause them, either directly or indirectly, to reevaluate what it is that they're expressing and doing, and then they tend to sort of take it back, or they become aware of, they sort of start to share your perspective on what they're doing, that you kind of elevate them by being saner at that time, miracles supply a lack given by those who temporarily have more to those who temporarily have less. If you are the have more and you're being the more sane of the two, you're able to provide and offer to the other person a perspective that they were shutting out of their mind, that by your broadcasting of it, the light in you shines into their mind and somewhat enlightens that in their mind. And it changes their own perception and changes their view of what's happening. And you know that it's not about you. This is some kind of pain that they're in. This is some kind of self-attack. Some way that they're cursing themselves, and they might be splurging it all over the room. They might be venting it all over the place and pointing fingers all over the place, being irresponsible. But if you're very sure and centered that this isn't true of them, and you can see past the illusion of the projection and the scapegoating, not buy into it and not take it personally and not use it to hurt yourself by your free will, then you set your brother free from his own imprisonment, and you're doing the opposite of cursing, you're blessing. And this is miraculous. This is a way that you're weakening your brother's belief in his own sinfulness and shining light into his mind and helping his mind to heal. So you can set your brother free from his self-imposed imprisonment by not agreeing to his imprisonment. You weaken his belief in his own imprisonment, because it's kind of like when you're really thinking stuff to yourself, when you're thinking it about yourself, it's sort of self-contained, and you almost kind of like need somebody to agree with you. And if they agree with you, it reinforces it in your mind. It sort of gives it validity, and you think, well, it must be true then, because this person over here thinks the same. When you don't have an external support like that, and it leaves your thing kind of free-floating, it's sort of is viewed as a self-contained thing, because you're recognizing it's inside the person's mind only. It's not really about you. This is self-attack. It's their mind doing it to themselves. You can see it's a call for love, and that's a whole other part of this. Let's see. Trying to see if there's something about this weakening. Healing only strengthens. Magic always tries to weaken. Healing perceives nothing in the healer that everybody else does not share with him. So when you're not agreeing with somebody's bullshit, and that doesn't mean disagreement, it means you're just in the real truth and you're not accusing, you are strengthening, because there's no neutral thoughts. You're either weakening or you're strengthening. Either you're cursing or you're blessing. So in the strengthening, because love is self-sustaining and strengthens itself, and that's kind of how it gets its power, that it reinforces itself. And so it's not just sort of a static state, it's actually an internally strengthening interweaving of love or something. This healing attitude of not cursing and not accusing and not imprisoning isn't just a neutral observation of what someone's doing. It's actually supplies a lack of love, since sin and imprisonment come from a lack of love. The tyrannical rulership is a lack of love. Supplies a loving perspective, and the problem that the person really had was a lack of love, the lack of their own love. And as the Course says, having denied your own love or your own power to heal yourself, the light in another mind must shine into yours, because that light is yours, and you need somebody else to kind of heal you for you, provide the love for you that you are denying, give you the freedom that you yourself are denying, supply the lack of love that you yourself are resisting the receiving of, strengthens the person. And its healing is strengthening. It's a way of integrating and reinforcing and giving power back and amplifying the truth and increasing the light. So by not imprisoning your brother and yourself along with him, you must be coming from a powerful state of love and healing, which is a strengthening thing. Because love always gives. Love is extension, it increases. So it has this property of resurrection, that it can restore and it can fill what's missing and it can overflow and it can expand and increase. So this loving attitude that sets your brother free by not imprisoning him to a body, not holding things against him, not accusing him of sins and crimes, not trying to punish him for what he's done that he hasn't really done, that love is empowering, and it actually gives your brother what he's trying to deny for him, and strengthens his own mind. But Jesus literally says in the Course, your mind has the power to shine into another mind and enlighten it. The minds that are joined cannot be sick. It's like you have an influence. Thoughts have an influence. If your brother goes into victim roles of cursing himself, he makes himself seem susceptible to the attacks of others. It seems as though others can co-curse him and further reduce his light by seeing him in a darkened way, a diminished way that tries to reject his light, is a way to try to anchor him into darkness and to take away his love by attacking him, seeing him as unloving. But this isn't a true communication, because it's a breakdown in communication. And because of the imprisonment part of it, and as you become unwilling and you become more imprisoning and tyrannical and attacking, you get separated off. It's an automatic thing where if you try to will against God's will, you will against willingness, you will against will itself, you become unwilling, you're not able to will anything. So you end up imprisoned in a body, powerless and unable, where you cannot attack your brother. So now what seems to be attacks from other people are not attacks from other people, because you cannot attack your brother. But it can appear as if you can curse him and seem to trigger his cursing of himself to get worse by his own agreement. But it really isn't possible to attack, because you cannot communicate attack. You can't communicate separation. Communication is joining and sharing. So separation causes a breakdown in communication, causing you to be unable to give death to your brother. You cannot destroy your brother. There can only be the illusion of attack, and the illusion that someone else is causing you, the illusion of being cursed by somebody, the illusion of being imprisoned by somebody and held in an unsupportive state of mind by their mind, or affected by them. You can't be affected by somebody else's fear, somebody else's attack, somebody else's problems, unless it seems you've chosen to attack yourself and resonate with it and join in it and want to suffer. And then by your own self-attack, you're making it seem as if other people can cause you to get worse, because you've set up sort of a trigger mechanism of saying, when they do this, I'm going to impose more suffering on myself to make it look like they're the cause of the suffering, and I can blame them for sin, and then I condemn them to hell and be exonerated from sin. Brother, at your hand I die, etc. So the opposite then is that if I give love, recognize the truth, see that somebody's not attacking me, but they're actually attacking themselves, that what looks like an attack upon me isn't really aimed at me, and I don't have guilt in myself that's getting triggered off, and I'm starting to think, oh, they're causing me to be upset now. If I'm calm and peaceful and centered and I don't have guilt, I cannot be affected by what they're doing. I will be very clear that what they seem to be doing isn't what they think it is, and I'm not falling for the temptation. I'm not being deceived by the illusion of the appearance of someone who looks like they're attacking someone other than themselves, that is really attacking themselves. And then you become able to recognize and acknowledge with greater clarity that this person is upset, they are hurting themselves, they're accusing themselves of sin. It sounds like they're pointing fingers beyond themselves at other people and who did what to who. All of it is their own thing. They're clearly in guilt. They're clearly accusing themselves. And all of this expression, no matter how it looks, no matter how deceiving it is, no matter how tempting, it's all them doing stuff to themselves. This is a self-contained inner conflict that this person's having, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with me. Because if I'm in my innocence and I haven't cursed myself, I cannot be affected by this. So it cannot be that I'm the cause of their problem or caused by their problem. So in this greater awareness and recognition and clarity, it becomes more obvious that other people's mental illness is theirs, even when it looks like it involves expressions that go beyond themselves. And it's kind of a thing you have to develop. It's almost a skill that you develop, this centeredness. It allows you to recognize that other people's suffering is self-inflicted. Just as you taking ownership and responsibility for your own stuff is the acknowledgement that all your suffering was self-inflicted and had nothing to do with your brother, and he's not the cause of you. So as you can recognize that someone's finger pointing is nothing to do with anyone other than themselves, and you look deeper and see past the surface appearance of this, it's not just somebody has been offended and they're angry. They're trying to get rid of their guilt. They're trying to scapegoat. They're trying to project. They're increasing the split in their mind. They're dissociating from ownership. They're in a state of irresponsibility. They're victimizing themselves, positioning themselves in a role of suffering. They see themselves as a victim. They're trying to get away with murder. They're attacking themselves. They're doing all kinds of stuff that's all ego that they are doing in their own mind to themselves. And it does not have to have anything to do with anyone else, even if it sounds like it does. And seeing that is forgiveness, because you're having to overlook the illusion of the obstacles to peace that they're putting there, trying to tempt you to agree with them as to them being true. They're trying to, it's almost like you hold a picture of crucifixion before your brother's eyes to try to convince him and yourself that you are guilty and suffering. So every attack thought, every way of expressing sin and guilt is all attempts to sort of say, I believe this is true. Do you agree? I think this is the truth about me and you, isn't it? And it almost sort of asks for external agreement because it lacks certainty and conviction. So now it almost has sort of an amount of dependency on someone else to validate it and to say, yeah, I agree with you. This is true. You are a fucked up person. Because nobody can be certain in a state of attack. Nobody can be calm and at peace. Nobody can be sane. Nobody can be sure of themselves. So that anybody that's in an attacked state is in fear, uncertainty, is unsure of themselves, is insecure. And there's, in that sort of mechanism, there's like a built-in way of being influenced by the opinions of others, whereby if somebody else doesn't agree with it, part of them doesn't agree with it because they're uncertain, and you can sort of tune into that and use that against the ego to undo it. So it's like if someone's attacking themselves, they are not sure of who they are and what they are, but they're broadcasting this image of themselves as a victim in the form of trying to victimize you, trying to make you out to be the scapegoat. And they're sort of asking for support. They're asking for agreement. They're not sure if they're guilty. They're not really certain that they're sinful. They don't really know what they're doing. They're not in their right mind. So what you do then, or how you express, or what position you hold, will very likely have an influence on this state of mind, because it's so unstable and it's so uncertain that if you support it, you're likely to reinforce their own belief in it being true, because they're not fully convinced. If you imprison them as well, it's likely to increase the amount that they believe they are cursed and imprisoned, because they are not all the way committed. So similarly, if you don't imprison them and you set them free in your mind by holding the vision of what really is true, recognition of the truth, not buying into ego bullshit and not reacting with ego bullshit, being certain and stronger and having more light and being the light of the world. Miracles are given by those who temporarily have more, given to those who have less. You're capable of seeming to influence the weak-minded. This is making me think of Star Wars now. Yes, you can have power over the weak-minded. They're easily manipulated. But if somebody is in this state, they are weak. They're weak-minded. They're flip-floppy and uncertain. So, if you affirm the truth about their freedom and their innocence, it is very likely that is going to steer them towards their own mind shifting towards a different conclusion, because they're not really convinced about their sinfulness anyway. So you are now strengthening who they are by being an example and a demonstration of what the truth is. Seems to influence and lift up the awareness of other people, as miracles raise the level of communication. That the light in your mind can shine into another mind and enlighten it. Increase the light in another mind by shining your light and holding space or holding the truth for this person. You can effectively lift them up into a higher level of sanity. I've heard stories about, I think Eckhart Tolle had I don't watch him very much, but there was one video I watched where he was talking about how this woman was somewhat insane, and she was in an institution, and he went to visit her, and while he was with her in a sane state of mind, she became sane, and her mind sort of attuned to his higher, more powerful resonant vibration or whatever. His signal, his broadcast overpowered her weakness and moved her mind into the light, and she became sane. And then when he would leave, she would dip that back down into insanity again, because that was her own doing to herself. So it's sort of like when a bright light comes close to you, you can see better. And while the light is there, everything is illuminated, and you have more awareness. When the light goes, you sort of go back into darkness again, and you can't see as well, and you're not quite so sure what things are. So there's this whole spectrum between being imprisoned, and the ultimate imprisonment would be stuck in a body, very cut off from everyone psychologically, hating everyone, being vicious and murderous, and being locked up in a prison. And it's interesting how in the world we have prisons where murderous people seem to symbolically end up being locked up. But the real imprisonment isn't the prison walls and the cell bars. The real imprisonment is the mental, psychological imprisonment that is anchoring people and identifying with being bodies, seeing themselves as not having freedom, being tyrannical, domineering, controlling, forceful, having all these ego properties, selfishness and attack and judgment and dominating and overpowering and trying to destroy. These are all the authority problem, the attempt to have authority over, power over freedom, to impose your will on another will and have no respect for the freedom of others. And that in this world tends to often lead to people going into prisons, because it sort of symbolically shows you that people become imprisoned within themselves and put themselves into states of imprisonment. And if somebody comes out of the prison without rehabilitation, i.e. psychological healing, forgiveness, they're going to re-offend because they are offensive and they get offended easily, and they're not willing, so they're unwilling to allow God's will to be done. They're unwilling to be free, really. There's a choice to be imprisoned. And we're all like that. We're all, whether we're in a prison cell or not, we're all basically making ourselves prisoners of the body, prisoners of space-time, prisoners of separateness and isolation, and not joining minds by having attitudes that are imprisoning, attitudes that associate bodies with spirit, attitudes that think that bodies have minds is imprisoning. So you can actually take on a role and a function where you are so free as a result of owning up to your freedom, which you can only do by taking responsibility, which is the secret of salvation. Everything that I'm experiencing, I'm doing to myself. I cannot suffer unless I attack myself. I cannot be hurt by anything but my own thoughts. I can only crucify myself. I can only accuse myself of sin. I can only make myself suffer. I can only die if I choose to do so. Is all part of owning the freedom of my free will, that I'm choosing this. I freely choose this. I'm making this happen. I want this. Myself is ruler of the universe. Nothing happens to me unbidden by myself. Even in this world, it is I who choose my destiny, because I am free. Jesus is constantly telling me you're free, and it takes a long time. It's taken a long time to have it sink in and accept it, and I haven't fully accepted it yet. I'm still working on trying to accept the sheer extent of my freedom, and it has to include not identifying as a body. It has to include setting other people free, and it has to include removing all of the tyrannical thoughts, beliefs, behaviors that are in the mind. Forgiveness is the movement towards the freedom of the will, because by being a little bit willing means being a little bit responsible, a little bit open to recognizing that you've got something to do with it, recognizing a little bit that you have in some way chosen this, recognizing that having a willingness to admit that you're doing some of this to yourself. That's a little bit of willingness that invites the Holy Spirit and is an openness to forgiveness. This is starting the forgiveness process, that you are moving towards more freedom by moving towards being more willing to admit the truth, more willing to accept the truth, more willing to own up to what you're doing, more willing to take back your power, more willing to confess that you are not a victim, more willing to recognize that you aren't being victimized by other people, that you're not caused by anything in the world, more willing to acknowledge that you have done this thing and it is this thing that I would undo is miraculous. So moving out of imprisonment of yourself and others towards the freedom of joined minds and sharing. This is what the Course is about. This is waking up. This is becoming aware of dreaming, is freedom from suffering, secret of salvation, that you're set free from every form of suffering by acknowledging that you're the one doing this to yourself, that you acknowledge it as your freedom. I have the freedom to do this myself, and I am the one that freely did this, and therefore having guilt is stupid. There's no grounds for guilt. All guilt is like a lie that you're saying, I didn't do this freely. I didn't have the freedom to do this, and it somehow did this unintentionally, and I didn't want it to happen, and now I feel regret. It's as if to say that you didn't freely choose and you didn't have the freedom. It's a denial of freedom. And so in order to undo sin, you have to own up to having the freedom to choose, the power of decision, to say, I am the one who believed in sin. I'm the one who has made the ego. I made the world. I have produced my own suffering. I am free to come and go. As Jesus says, no one comes to the atonement except freely. And free will must lead to freedom. You can't have freedom and free will separate. You have to have both. If you want to have freedom, you've got to set free. So your willingness to set yourself free is going to set other people free. And when you're not supportive of the condemnation and the sin of others, when you forgive it by overlooking it, to forgive is to overlook, and you recognize what's true and what's false, and you're no longer condemning people or holding against them the things that they seem to be doing that are illusions, you are being the light of the world, and you are being a beacon of reality that's shining in the dream, in the mind, and is potentially going to have influence on other people's minds, healing them, miraculously undoing their suffering, and restoring bodies, raising the dead, the physical resurrection, and the psychological resurrection. So moving towards freedom is going to empower you to raise the dead. When you are imprisoned, you are in a dead state. You don't have life because you've rejected it. Freedom brings you back to life. So you have to set yourself free from death by being willing to do God's will and accept God's will for you. God's will for you is perfect happiness. God wills that you be with Him. God wills that you can never suffer and die. You've got to accept all these truths about the freedom of your will, so that the mind can return to being under the authority of Christ, under the authority of the soul, so that the mind is used in service, sort of obeying the soul's wishes, rather than running rogue and choosing for itself and not wanting to will. That the mind is put back in a position of just being a tool, being a selfless tool for the soul to use to create. I think there's yeah, to change your mind means to place it at the disposal of true authority. The miracle is thus a sign that the mind has elected to be guided by Christ in his service. The abundance of Christ is the natural result of choosing to follow him. This leads on immediately after the part about the tyrants and the tyrannical rulership. So, if the mind does not freely elect to be a medium by which the soul creates along the lines of its own creation, it retains its creative ability but places itself under tyrannous rather than authoritative control, the authority of the Spirit or Christ. As a result, it creates imprisonment because such are the dictates of tyrants. When you're being unwilling to will with God, you become this rebellious, I want to have it my way, I want everything to be how I want it, I'm just going to walk all over everybody and deny everybody's freedom. But to change your mind means to place it at the disposal of true authority. So the true final atonement, change of mind, is choosing to get out of all tyrannical rulership, the ego thought system, and switch over to having the mind be purely in service to the Spirit. The miracle, the atonement, is the sign that the mind has elected through free will to be guided by Christ in his service. The abundance of Christ is the natural result of choosing to follow him. So we're sort of putting the mind back as a medium that the soul is using to do its bidding in service to God and Christ, rather than the mind going off by itself and making nasty problems. So that kind of brings us full circle. And this is a theme, if you think about your life, if you think about the world, you think about society and what we do to each other and all the dynamics of relationships, this is all over the place. This attempts to imprison, attempts to control, attempts to find people to be criminal, accusation of sin and judgment, associating people with bodies and with physical objects and events, trying to diminish people, cutting people down, all forms of attack, every kind of murderousness. It's all the rejection of freedom, the rejection of the freedom of the will, and the attempt to imprison yourself and everybody else. And so waking up is a return to freedom, where the mind is now completely free from ego and is free to be used by the soul purely for constructive purposes. So imprisonment and freedom, it's the same dynamic, forgiveness and unforgiveness, reality, unreality, light and darkness, holiness and unholiness, freedom and imprisonment. These are aspects of the same thing. That all our relationships are either states of imprisoning and cursing, or blessing and healing and setting free. And it's up to you to choose which one you want. But if you choose to be an imprisoner, you will be imprisoned. If you choose to be a blesser and a healer, you will be blessed and healed. I'm going to stop now, and hopefully this was somewhat useful. It's kind of an interesting way to think about stuff in the course and in relationships. Another perspective. Have a good day. Talk to you again soon, and bye for now.